Welcome back to my ongoing series on this book written by Roth and Friedman called Surviving a Borderline Parent: How to Heal Your Childhood Wounds, Build Trust, Boundaries, and Self-Esteem. We've been going through this series and I cannot do every single chapter, but I'm going to start summarizing them because the whole series could go on for weeks. There are so many great things in this book. I highly recommend it if you feel that this topic applies to you and your story. So let's talk about, we're still in the chapter talking about what happens to the children of parents who struggle with borderline. And I want to just quickly say thank you to all of you who posted so many lovely and supportive comments on my last video. It meant so much to me, and the way that you were so thoughtful and even making me think about something that I needed to think about, which is my own responses to this trigger. And the truth is that, I am someone who doesn't like to hurt people, and being a psychologist, therapist means that hopefully that's not my intention. And so I think that's also, when you combine my childhood with this job, I think it's an easy place for me to feel easily wounded. And I literally almost just was like, I can't handle this, because it feels like childhood. And so I have to work on setting up boundaries. And I'm doing a pretty good job after doing this for a few years. But people can get, it's just funny. They're just like rude, or they make up, they just say rude things. It's like, would you actually say that if you were sitting in a seminar? Like, I get it. This is free content and you don't owe me anything. But it's just kind of funny because I'm just like, oh my God, that's my kids. I'll be like, I'll call my daughter or my son like, oh my God, someone just said blah, blah, blah. And they're like, Mom, like, get over it, just block them. And so that's what I'm doing. So just know, if you're freaking rude, I'm going to block you. Or if you have something that's just not even a thoughtful reply, that's not helpful, I'll probably block you. Like, I don't want to deal with it. And actually, this whole series of doing this and watching a few things this past weekend, I'm going to talk about soon, have really spurred some great ideas for me to start sharing some sort of like content that is based in all of us having these experiences, but more driven towards our daily lives. And so I'm really excited to see how you feel about that when I finish this series. Okay, let's get into it. So the first thing this part of the book talks about is the impact on us, and how a lot of what happens with parents with borderline is they can transfer their feelings onto us. That's a lot of that. We've talked about transference and splitting and projection, all of those types of things, or those names you've heard around psychology topics, are really what's happening. It's oftentimes that they have a hard time with how they feel, or they judge themselves or whatever, and so they put that onto you. And it talks about the effects on our lives as their children being our own anger, a sense of having a weak sense of self and knowing who we are. And it says that we may lack our own defined sense of self, because it's hard to know who you really are when someone is superimposing their views onto you, telling you it's what you really believe or want. And it cites some research, which I've talked about, around the children of borderline mothers historically, and these would be highly clinical populations. But it says there are many documented effects, including increased risk of depression, attempts to self-wound, poor self-esteem, social anxiety, intimacy issues. It's pretty significant. And the research that I found shows that as a whole, we are at a much higher risk for lifetime issues related to our psychiatric well-being or lack of well-being. And so our risk is a lot higher. And that does tie into the next part of it, which talks about the attachment patterns. And of course, it's no surprise that moms who have been diagnosed with borderline often may exhibit an attachment pattern that is similar to the disorganized or fearful avoidant dynamic. And that is because they are really, as I've talked about, frightened and frightening. They can be the source of safety, but also the source of fear. They might be great one day, and the next day, you're the worst child ever. And so it talks about how kids who have these kind of parents, it says, have little confidence in an available safety net, and therefore they deny their need of support and care from others. They've parented themselves and often their own siblings from early on, and they learn not to get close or trust others. This is a huge part of our recovery from difficult childhoods with these kind of parents, is that people were the wound. People are the trigger. And so why would we ever want to let someone in? And the hard part is that it is it's not something that we have language for when we develop this way of being, as I've said. And so it's our normal. And even the book says this. It says, and even if they realize it wasn't completely normal, or that they really weren't happy as children or adults, they may not have much of a concept about how things could have been different. And I really do, you can see here, I did a whole thing here. I want to read it to you. It says the ideal relationship. Children want and need to believe that their parents will provide protection. The alternative, that a parent is incapable of taking care of them, is unthinkable to a child. That's when I've talked about if the choice is between safety and attachment and survival, I'm going to choose the survival and attachment. Children need to believe that what a parent says is logical, honest, and for their own good. Many adult children say they felt very close to their parent with BPD and that they had a great and healthy relationship. Some recall stretches of good years and now, looking back, realize they'd idealized their relationship. And so it says in another quote from a book from John Bradshaw's books on childhood trauma, creating love. What we grow up with is what we come to view as normal. Our childhood is like the air we breathe. We take it for granted. And so the bottom line is we often don't even know to question these things. And as I've said, I really truly believe, given the dynamic of trauma as it relates to this disorder, given the dynamic of emotional and relational instability at the core, with a lot of other dynamics, of course, that there are more people walking around with this pattern where not necessarily they're diagnosed borderline, but they have these extreme swings in emotional and relational security and safety for you. It's not always bad. Or like I've said, there were stretches in years where it was actually good. It happened to be the only few years when there was no one else around, but that's significant. And so I really want that to validate what's happening. And then it goes into 6 seeds to grow a healthy child. And I'm not going to go into them, but I will give you the general idea. And I think this book is obviously a significantly 20-year-old book, and parenting techniques tend to evolve. But these are, indisputable in my perspective. So obviously we need a parent who is supportive, who is respectful and accepts us as for who we are, no matter who we grow up to be. They allow us to have a voice and be heard. They give us unconditional love and affection. They're consistent and they provide security. And so we're talking about, of course, raising young children. I know that for many people, they've said, well, what if your child is an adult with borderline? And I know that that is a difficult dynamic. I will say that having an adult child with mental health issues is one of the most difficult things on the planet. It really is. And so I don't want to discount that either, that your love is just, easy to give in the way that it was to a 5-year-old when you have an adult child who could be incredibly hurtful. But this channel is mostly for those of us who are raised by these parents who have no real awareness, whether it's because of their childhood, their generation, their lack of exposure to therapy and things like that. Because the truth is that previous generations have not been exposed to the degree that any of us, even we have, to parenting techniques and conversations. So it talks about the 6 seeds, and one of the exercises it suggests is that you go through and look at the places in your life where this parent did provide some, maybe what I call good love to you, or security, or what felt like some connection, and then where it didn't, and to break those down and to journal about how you think those things have impacted you. And then it talks about it being, which, I sort of hate this, but it is true, that there's an inherent resiliency we have to develop as children of any kind of complicated childhood to survive it. The problem is the things that kept us in the resiliency phase, or we seemed fine, often play out in the symptoms of our physical and mental health in our adult lives. And so it looks like resiliency, and in many regards it is. I've even said to my kids, it's like I will put it, and I said this to patients, if I'm in a room with people and something massive is going down, I am more likely to look to the person, this is obviously an example, not a real example, but someone who has had childhood trauma is going to know what to do before the person who had the quote-unquote perfect childhood, which of course no one has. But the truth is that a lot of these things do make us, I'm a fighter, I'm a survivor, and I would not be here given what happened in my adult life if I didn't have at least some internal structure. I wish it had not come at the cost of having 2 really, really, truly unsafe, emotionally unsafe and otherwise parents. But we don't want to deny that, right? We're talking so much about the negative stuff, which is I think, important because I want this to be a space where we're really honest about what it feels like. But also don't forget, and I don't want to sugarcoat this, but there are some strengths that you have that if you look around, others may not have. And so that is important because life is going to get hard. There's no guarantee that your adult life won't be even harder than your childhood, right? It might be your, it's not true that like, oh, I had the hard childhood, so the adult life's going to be easy. If you've lived, at least 20 years, you know that life is extremely unpredictable, especially in the world we're living in now. So then it talks about the importance of role models and others in your life and maybe any positive influences you might have. And where I think this video today is really meant to support you is that all of the things that you know that you've thought and to be true about your story, this chapter 2 really supports and talks about what I've said, which is the evolution of your own development of your traumatized self has become part of your armor and part of your personality. And as I just said, there are some parts about that will give you, I don't want to say an advantage, but frankly, in some ways, yes, because life is going to throw things at you. But it also, I hope, at the core validates a lot of the things that you struggled with. And honestly, one of the biggest things is the internalized guilt. The internalized guilt, especially if you had a parent who wasn't always bad, and that struggle in your mind between, do I have all these things, and are they related to this parent who was so chaotic? I've had so many patients with borderline, very significant to me at least. It seems obvious. I wouldn't diagnose them because I'm not their therapist, but the patient's mothers specifically, and sometimes fathers, obviously, but we often talk a lot about the primary attachment figure, who is most often a mom, but it can be anybody. But they really struggle with with this person, they really struggle with like, wait a minute, was it that bad? But it wasn't always bad. And then they feel so much guilt because there has been some connection there in love that when they're talking bad about them in therapy and trying to make sense of their own pain, they don't know how to compare it to anybody else. That's all they've ever known. And so that they're like, but that's still my mom. And so I feel the same way. I totally understand that. So the purpose of this whole series is to really validate your story. I will see you tomorrow. We're going to talk about grief and grieving a lost childhood when it comes to having a parent who may have struggled or struggles with borderline personality disorder. So thanks for being here. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.